So I asked, I can't remember if it was Karine Jean-Pierre or if it was Jen Psaki, if President Biden would drink the water in East Palestine. And if I'm remembering correctly, she replied that this was not about political stunts.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Friday, January 31st. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RealClearPolitics, joined tonight by Phil Wegmann, our White House reporter based in Washington, D.C., and Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief and executive editor, currently based in Jamaica. Carl, welcome back to the show. Are you feeling rested and ready?
And rested and ready, just like Nixon in 1972.
Just like Nixon. Great. All right, well, let's start tonight, gentlemen, by talking about Donald Trump's press conference yesterday, where he talked about this crash, this horrific crash that took place in Washington, D.C. The other evening. Phil, you were there, asked a question at the briefing. Give us a sense of, Trump started off and was very, remorseful. He was talking about how we were one nation and we were all grieving. And that lasted a few minutes. And then he went on the attack and talked about DEI programs and how that might have contributed to the cause of this. Caroline Leavitt faced those questions today, again at the briefing. But give us a sense of what it was like in the room yesterday.
You described it perfectly, because for the first 5 minutes or so in my notes, I was thinking Donald Trump is pulling this off. There have been times where he has struggled with empathy, and he was pitch perfect at the beginning of that briefing. He called for a moment of silence. He talked about how this was a tragedy that united all Americans. And he had a line which almost seemed like it was echoing what we heard from Ronald Reagan and the Challenger disaster, when he said that while it was tragic that the victims of this disaster lost their lives, they did not perish in the Potomac. Instead, they were embraced by a warm, almighty God. And then almost immediately afterwards, there's a pivot where he returns to the theme of his administration thus far, which is really an opposition to these DEI programs. And he goes on the offensive. He says that the previous administration elevated race and ethnicity and other factors over meritocracy, and that was making Americans less safe. The problem, though, is that when he was pressed for specific evidence of whether or not these DEI policies were involved in this particular crash, the president fell back on this argument of, well, I have common sense. But what we know from the investigation thus far, and again, we're at the very beginning of all of this, there's no indication that DEI played a factor in the hiring of the air traffic controller, of the helicopter pilots, or of the airline passengers. And so it was up to Vice President JD Vance, who also went to the podium, and this was his first appearance in the briefing room, to make a larger argument, not about specifics, but about generalities, where he said that even if you have one person who is elevated to a position that they're not qualified for, and even if they're not involved, it makes the system overall weaker. And, this is the topic that has put this administration very much on the defensive. I think that for as long as this investigation goes on, you're going to have the media asking about what Donald Trump said right out of the gate.
Carl, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would say and guess that you were not a fan of Donald Trump's press conference yesterday.
Well, yeah, and I thought what Phil said, yeah, it started out just right, and he was reading from prepared remarks, and he sometimes does okay when he reads from prepared remarks. Then they went into this other, it was like a speech presentation. It wasn't really a speech, it was a news conference, but like written by two people. The first part by whoever wrote that, and then the second by Trump. He's going through the FAA, website and stuff. That's like a drunk in a bar. That's not like a president. Oh, yeah, they're hiring mental defectives, and that he lost the plot there. The president did, I thought. And the other thing, Tom, the pushback from the Democrats was in the media, but I guess I repeat myself, was
you do actually
was instantaneous. Trump makes baseless allegations. Trump does this and that. And Pete Buttigieg was particularly harsh. I guess he feels aggrieved because he's been singled out. But but the Biden administration boasted until pretty much, the last 3 months of the general election campaign that DEI was one of their most important objectives in hiring and in personnel in every single agency in the government.
They said equity was at the center of everything they did.
Yeah. And so when Trump says, I have common sense, that is actually a common sense response to look for that. When that horrific crash happened, and I use, Tom, you and I use that airport constantly. My first thought was, I remember thinking, I hope this doesn't have anything to do with DEI. I mean, just sort of involuntary blurted out to myself, and it may not, but this idea that there's a class action suit against the FAA over air traffic controllers. There is an active group of air traffic controllers who've changed the entrance exam. They've worked hard to get more minorities in and altered the specifications. So this is not some just insane, crazy talk, but it wasn't the time to engage in it. It wasn't, the president shouldn't be speculating. He shouldn't have talked about this at all this soon. There's time for that to come out. And if this ends up having something to do with it, there'll be changes. But what's so startling to me and was, Phil, Tom, I'd be interested in what you think. I see more and more helicopters around Washington all the time, not just the 3 helicopters assigned to Marine One, the president's chopper and the other 2 or their decoys, but there's complaints in Arlington County supervisors. Arlington County does not have helicopters, but Fairfax County does. There's other helicopters, the Coast Guard. You cross the 14th Street Bridge or the Theodore Roosevelt Bridge. It's rare you don't see a helicopter, it seems. And why their helicopters are allowed to operate in that space, night training missions, retraining, whatever they call it. There's some report that they had night goggles on. The Washington Post reported some really solid reporting, said there's only 1 air traffic controller there in the room. There should have been 2, which is something that's there's going to be a congressional investigation at. But also, there were near misses 24 hours earlier at that airport. And then a week before that, a plane coming in, passenger jet, and the pilot has to abort the takeoff because there's a helicopter in the way. And what you think the commander-in-chief would focus on immediately is making that airspace safe and leave this other area of inquiry to another day, another time, and a more thorough and careful vetting of this. This is something that should be brought up very, very thoughtfully and very consciously and with facts, not just speculation. So yeah, that's what I thought.
So Phil, what does the White House think about this? Did you get any sort of sense of whether they thought, this was a mistake, the president sort of, the timing was wrong? Because again, Carolyn Leavitt was asked about it at today's briefing, and she defended it. She said, listen, as the president said yesterday, she defended the broad point, which I think, and she said most Americans agree with, and I agree with her, that when you're flying, you don't care what race or sex or nationality or anything. The people who are either doing the flying or doing the air traffic controlling, you just want the best people in those jobs, just like you want the best people when you go into surgery or whatever, and not hired on a basis of skin color or anything else. That being said, to Carl's point, I think the timing was, he took a lot of grief for that, and maybe that was a point better left to be made later on. Is the White House, do they think it was a mistake? Is there a sense that maybe, that was an own goal, or not getting any sense of that at all?
I'm not getting that sense right now, because the third rail of this administration is whatever Donald Trump says. The fastest way for you to find yourself out the door is to disagree with him. And certainly Caroline Leavitt, someone who knows him better than most, I mean, her first job in politics was at the previous White House, is not going to disagree with him. But, I sense a little bit of hesitation sort of behind the scenes, because this White House, they felt very confident things were going their way. They were flooding the zone, so much so that you didn't really have a resistance moment like there was during the first administration. And I think that maybe if you gave a few of them a truth serum, they might say that this general argument about the system overall it's difficult to have that argument when all of us are focusing on specifics, on this specific crash that occurred. And, Republicans, they have been going on for some time about a lowering of standards. I mean, just, 2 years ago, then Senator JD Vance helped sink the Biden FAA nominee, a gentleman by the name of Phil Washington, specifically over questions of equity. And he said, look, I'm in favor of a type of Rooney rule if there's a particular group of society that hasn't had this opportunity, but the main thing has to be the main thing. And that's safety. Well, in this moment of crisis, the main thing ought to be the main thing. And that's the crisis at hand, not a larger ideological debate.
But Tom, the point you made about, brain surgeons, should we be interested in affirmative action for that? Well, the medical schools have been leading the way on DEI in this country. And this, Tom, because you follow it. I think it was United Airlines CEO said, he wants 50% of the pilots to be DEI hires. So the Republicans aren't just sort of making this up. This is not coming out of nowhere.
And that's what I think some conservatives are frustrated by, because they feel that by shooting from the hip and making this argument about DEI without the facts, that the White House sort of undercuts what they see as factual arguments with this speculation.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to take a break, and we will be back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM right after this. Stick around. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. We're talking with Phil Wegmann, our White House reporter, Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief, beaming in from the sunny climes of Jamaica. Mr. Cannon, I don't know, do you get TV down there? Or are you just laying on the beach? Did you see any of the nomination hearings that took place yesterday? We had 3 of them going on at the same time. Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, and RFK Jr. was doing his second round. Did you get to catch any of this? And what do you make of, let's talk about Kash Patel in particular, because that's the hearing that I watched. And, they got after him, the Democrats got after him particularly. I guess the newsiest exchange was with Adam Schiff, where Schiff tried to get him to turn around and look at the Capitol police officers that were sitting behind him, and Kash Patel would not take the bait.
Yeah, I did watch it, Tom, and I watched that in particular. There's a Robert Trent Jones golf course here that I've been playing this week, and the slogan of that is that the sun never sets on a Robert Trent Jones golf course. You've heard that, of course, and that means that they're all over the place. Well, the sun never sets on CNN either, Tom, and so I've been given a force-fed a diet of these hearings. I thought,
the ratings are going to go through the roof now that Cannon's watching. That's a 10% increase.
Adam Schiff, who's now a United States Senator, the last time Republicans paid any attention to him, they were censoring him for lying about Russiagate. Now he's a senator, and he doesn't seem to have been chastened, or he doesn't seem any kind of, he's still as aggressive and partisan.
Being censored made him a senator.
As he was in the House. He had that cheap stunt he tried to pull on Patel, who said, who didn't look around and said, and Schiff asked him the same question. It wasn't really a question. They aren't really asking questions, I've noticed, these Democrats. They're just either giving their opinions or hurling accusations, or in some cases just yelling at the nominees. Do you think a person who would promote a video that, glorified January 6th should be director of the FBI? That was, turn around, look at these people. They're Capitol Police, they're defending, look them in the eye. And, Patel maybe missed his opportunity. He didn't humor Adam Schiff, but he just said, well, you say that should a person censored by the House for lying be in the Senate? We can play that game, sir. He didn't. He just kind of, sneered back at him. And you realize through all these candidates, well, exception of really of Tulsi Gabbard, and a couple of instances, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., they're not really engaging the Democrats. They don't think they're going to get their votes. These controversial nominees, they don't act like they want their votes. And I don't think that Adam Schiff, you like to say this, Tom, no minds were changed. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, they don't need the Democrats' votes if they can get all the Republican votes. But the question is, are they going to get all the Republican votes? I want to do a round on Tulsi because I think, based on what we saw the other day, she might be the one who's in the most jeopardy at the moment. But Phil, what's your read on how Kash Patel did and what happened at that hearing?
Kash Patel strikes me as someone who didn't think that he was going to be returning to power. He was brazen in his support of some of the January 6th defendants in some of the products that he sold. I mean, we're talking wines and books, and yet before that, I mean, Republicans considered Kash Patel a very serious guy because he was the chief anti-architect, if you will, of the Steele dossier and Russiagate. And so Republicans, they like the guy, and they would love to see him at the FBI because they are of the opinion that certain corners of that building have become a political pigsty, and they want someone to come in there and be brazen and clean it up. I think that, Patel certainly is one of the guys who, going into that hearing, he knew he wasn't going to get a single Democratic vote. Maybe Tulsi would, maybe RFK would. They can hope for a bit of bipartisanship. Kash Patel very much knows that the only way he's going to get to the FBI is if Republicans hang together. And so it was almost like this bunker mentality where he was playing for an audience of one, which was Donald Trump, and he's hoping that Donald Trump can lean on Republicans and get him into this role.
Carl, there was an article in the New York Times that came out earlier today that said, and here's the title: Trump administration shocks senior FBI ranks by moving to replace them. Apparently, a bunch of the senior folks at the FBI have been asked to resign. Why would this be shocking to them or the New York Times? I don't understand why. Isn't that what Trump ran on?
Yes, and he said that it's a thoroughly politicized agency, and he's called the leaders all kinds of names. That it wasn't shocking. The headline, what did Trump say? Fake news. It wasn't fake news in that respect, but feigning surprise. It's like that famous Casablanca line. I'm shocked. Trump's firing people he hates.
Well, let's talk about Tulsi Gabbard because, as I mentioned, her hearing, she was, I think, received some grilling from Republicans and Democrats, all of whom seemed there was a lot of focus on Edward Snowden, and this question of whether he's a traitor or not. They kept repeating they wanted her to say it. They wanted her to say it so bad, and she wouldn't. She didn't. She said he broke the law, but he also discovered and revealed that the U.S. government was operating in an unconstitutional manner. That didn't seem to impress a lot of the Democrats or some of the Republicans on the committee. Phil, what do you think of what happened yesterday? I mean, do you think Tulsi is her nomination in jeopardy?
It may be she got a bit of assistance from Senator Tom Cotton with his support, and perhaps in the end she'll sneak through. But the exchanges on Snowden are particularly interesting because in Tulsi Gabbard, what you have is the face of this realignment among Republicans when it comes to the Intelligence Committee. She echoes a lot of the concerns that Donald Trump has when it comes to the way that the CIA and others have been operating. In this case, the NSA with Mr. Snowden. And so you have an old guard that is sort of clinging to the old Republican consensus, especially when it comes to national security issues. And I think that the Snowden example is really illuminating here because it would be hypocritical for her to call him a traitor. And also, I think it would take away one of the chief selling points of her nomination, which is that she is something new. And while Republicans might be frustrated with her on that account, who else has praised Edward Snowden? Well, Matt Gaetz introduced legislation with Tulsi Gabbard in the House to call for his pardon. He's a close confidant of the Trump family. And also Donald Trump Jr., the president's own son, has called for a pardon. So in her nomination, we're not just going to see if Trump gets another cabinet pick. I think we're going to see, a microcosm of this battle for what do Republicans actually believe about, the IC and, what's done in the dark.
Well, you know what Phil's saying there, Tom, I'll add to that. That word traitor, that wasn't an accident. They kept using that over and over again. And it was like you could see the mind turning in the Democrats, the ads that they want to run in the midterm election. Trump pardons traitor, and traitor is not a word that members of Congress should actually apply to an American citizen who has not been convicted of a crime. It's a loaded term. It's a legal term. The punishment for it is very severe. But the Republicans can't complain about that because Donald Trump goes around calling people traitors, and he called Mark Milley a traitor. It's the word he used. So I think that's a term that the Democrats are using on purpose, and it's a pitfall for the president and the administration. But it also seems kind of obscene to apply it to Tulsi Gabbard, who's a combat veteran, who's a member of Congress. She was a Democrat. She was a colleague of Adam Schiff's, the person we were talking about earlier. And she served in the House. She ran for president. And the suspicion that she showed for the intelligence community, for the FBI, most of the CIA, that was shared by liberals in this country through most of my lifetime. The stuff she has said would have been sort of, liberal dogma for years. And suddenly, it's flipped. So I think that, but still, she doesn't seem, a lot of people, these Republicans, they wonder if she's qualified for this job. They would have loved to support her as head of the VA or something. Tom Cotton, you mentioned him, Tom. He's chairing the committee hearing. Pretty faint praise, maybe we need a disruptor, I mean, yeah, I'm still not sure that that's going to go through. What do you think, Tom? I'm still not sure she's going to be confirmed.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's hanging. Look, she does. I mean, and I think she mounted a good defense of herself in terms of highlighting the fact that she, has had a security clearance of various levels for the last 20 years. She mentioned this fact that within 24 hours of criticizing, Kamala Harris, that she was put on a terror watch list. So she's been the victim of some of this politicization of the intelligence services, weaponizing it against our own citizens. So I mean, I definitely look. In my opinion, she's more than qualified for this job. And again, it's just a question of, will Republicans give Donald Trump his nominee or not, or will they find a reason to vote against her? And I think it's going to be close. I think from what I saw, and maybe they'll change their minds, but from what I saw, Phil, I saw something I think it was on X last night, about how they were talking about voting in secret on this. Did you hear about that? Is that true? Are they actually going to vote on this in secret? That would seem to me to be, yeah, in committee. Yeah. That would seem to be outrageous.
Certainly, that's not something that the Tulsi Gabbard camp wants. They want a record here because they know that what's fueling the engine for some of these more unconventional nominees is grassroots support. And they want that vote on the record so that they can tell any senator, particularly Republicans, who's thinking of balking the new party line, by the way, if you vote against Tulsi Gabbard, we have a lot of, very wealthy donors waiting in the wings to fund your primary challenger.
Right. All right, guys, we're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this. And we are back. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief, and Phil Wegmann, our White House reporter. Phil, Selena Zito of the Washington Examiner broke news earlier today that the Vice President, JD Vance, will be visiting East Palestine, Ohio tomorrow, the second anniversary of that tragic accident that took place. What do you make of that? Clear symbolism here. I mean, obviously it's his home state. Obviously, that's a place that Joe Biden caught a lot of grief because he did not respond to that. They did not.
Much of it from you, Tom Bevan.
Well, rightfully so, I think. I think he showed
Phil, before you answer, Tom knows what I'm going to say. He called it a tragedy. No one died. It's one of, I don't know, 10,000 derailments that happen every year in this country. The idea that and they berated Biden I don't know if Pete Buttigieg wasn't there. He may have been on paternity leave or something. I can't remember. He didn't respond real well either. But
Okay.
why should a president of the United States have to go, or even a vice president, to a place where there's no deaths? We have things like this every day in this country. That's all they do is go to these.
Sure. I mean, why would you want to go to a place where there's just like a mushroom cloud of poisonous gas descending on this community and killing all the fish? And I mean, yeah, no one died that day, Carl, but I can promise you there will be people who have been affected that will, from this thing that will last a long, long time. So,
Well, if Andy was here, he'd break the tie. We're not going to ask you to do that. Just go ahead and answer Tom's question, and I'll stay out
but
of
Phil,
it.
you've got some history on this subject. You covered it at the time.
I did. Look, if you want to see what American carnage looks like in the minds of Donald Trump and company, they would point you to East Palestine. This was Exhibit A during the campaign of how the Biden administration wasn't doing enough for flyover country, that this was typical coastal elites who didn't care about the little guy. And so they had to be browbeat into moving faster. They had to be browbeat into taking this more seriously. That was the impression that Republicans fostered. Democrats in the White House, they said that they were on top of this from day one, but you heard a lot of firsthand accounts from people who live in East Palestine that FEMA didn't have their act together, that the railroad was shirking responsibility, and that their water had been contaminated. And so during one of those briefings, I asked, a bit of a curveball question, but it is one that was first introduced by, then President Obama, who drank the water in Flint, Michigan, to prove that it was safe. And so I asked, I can't remember if it was Karine Jean-Pierre or if it was Jen Psaki, if President Biden would drink the water in East Palestine. And if I'm remembering correctly, she replied that this was not about political stunts. Well, the people there who have to drink it every day, who have to shower in it, the new mother who has to make baby formula out of that water, she would like to know whether or not it's safe. And, President, he ended up endorsing the work there. He put his, money where his mouth was, and he actually took a sip of water in East Palestine. So I think that this will be an example of JD Vance going back saying, look, I pushed the previous administration to work hard to fix this. There's more that needs to be done. I won't forget you.
So bottom line, once again, I'm on the rump end of a 2-1 vote, Tom.
Well, Carl, look, it's about symbolism. It's about, showing that you have some Joe Biden was supposed to be Mr. Empathy, right? Working class Joe from Scranton couldn't find his way to East Palestine, Ohio for how long was it, guys? It was months. It was,
but he's also
even been.
Yeah, but what he's really known for in the Senate, Tom, was being a stubborn son of a gun. Once the Republicans were pushing him to do it, he didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
I will say, Trump was asked the other day if he was going to visit the site of the crash in DCA, and he was kind of snarky. He told the reporters, where do you want me to go? Do you want me to go swimming? So Donald Trump himself
said, are you going to visit the crash site? He said he was going to go, and they're like, are you going to the crash site? And he said, well, it's in the water. What do you want me to do? Go swimming?
Still, I mean, like,
probably a little flippant, a little cheeky.
There's a bit of an empathy deficit with this administration as well. But the point, I think, stands. I'm Midwest over all the other coasts, and those people, they felt overlooked.
Yeah. All right, shifting gears, another member of the administration is on the road, and that is Marco Rubio, who headed off to Central America. His first trip. He wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal. We carried it on RealClearPolitics this morning. Cannon, talk about symbolism. Marco Rubio makes this his first trip. He's going to be visiting a number of countries, including, apparently, Panama.
Yeah.
To discuss that sticky wicket. What do you make of Marco Rubio's first trip?
Well, yeah, I don't. How do you ask for the canal back? What's the polite way to say that? No one uses the phrase Indian giver anymore, but we gave it to them. We built it. They gave it to him. Now, nope. We've decided we want it back. That would be an awkward conversation. What he's going to talk about mostly in Central America, and is stemming the flow of this unlimited flow of migrants, turning off the spigot. That was supposed to be Kamala Harris's brief, remember? And she did go to Central America. But people are making rational economic decisions when they leave. As Jeb Bush famously said, it's an act of love. Well, we got to show Marco's going to show them a little tough love.
Phil, what do you know about the trip, and what are you hearing about it? I mean, obviously, first trip for a Secretary of State is important and obviously carries a lot of symbolism. And the fact he's going to Central America says volumes about, this administration, this president, his priorities.
It really does. The geography tells the story, because if you think about it, there's a land war in Europe. The Middle East is still smoldering. That could pop off at any day. China continues to be increasingly aggressive. Secretary of State Rubio has spoken at length about each of those issues, and I don't say this to downgrade those, but first and foremost, immigration is at the top of his mind, and so he's taking this trip in line with the mandate of the current administration, which is they want an end to the crisis at the southern border. And I'm not surprised that he's going to Central and South America first, because if you read that cable that we broke exclusively at RealClearPolitics just last week, he said, the first priority was that the era of mass migration must end. And so now he's going to get down to the diplomatic business of achieving that.
Carl, we've got about 2 minutes left in this segment, and there was another thing that Caroline Leavitt was asked about at the press conference today, which is tariffs, and that she said tomorrow that these tariffs are going to be imposed. 25% on Canada, 25% on Mexico, 10% on China. And the punishment is because these countries are not stopping the flow of immigrants and fentanyl into the United States, which is killing 100,000 Americans per year. I know you're a big fan of tariffs. So did you want to weigh in on this?
Tom is being ironic for those of you listening to us for the first time. If your rationale is immigration and fentanyl, you could argue that Mexico, that there's some legitimacy there. That's not really what bothers Donald Trump. It bothers him is the trade imbalance, and he's blurted this out several times. There's no real rationale for Canada to be subjected to this. Is our closest neighbor.
He's just trolling Trudeau.
Yeah, and he used to do it to bother Justin Trudeau. Well, he's leaving, so he doesn't need to do that, and it makes no sense. The other thing, though, about Canada and Mexico, but more Mexico than Canada, is that Trump objects to Chinese companies importing stuff to those countries, and then they're importing stuff here, and he thinks that's a violation of the spirit of whatever that thing is called, the son of NAFTA, that he rewrote. But we have a treaty with Canada, and I think he's abrogating the treaty unilaterally, and I don't think the president has the authority to do that or should do that. 2 senators today, Democratic senators, Kane and Kuntz, introduced a bill to to take away the power of presidents to unilaterally enact tariffs. It's not going to pass the Senate, but it's going to be out there as an issue to come and a campaign issue. And I don't think Trump's on the right side of history, as the Democrats like to say.
All right, Carl, you're going to get the last word today. We got to leave it there. And we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to be talking with Austin Berg, who's with the Illinois Policy Institute, about Brandon Johnson and the city of Chicago. Interesting conversation. Stick around. Be right back after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined now by Austin Berg. He's the vice president of marketing for the Illinois Policy Institute. Austin, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, I have to say, too, that I'm a huge fan of your work. I've lived in Chicago for a long, long time, and I follow you on X, and that's how I get a lot of my news. I don't read the Sun-Times anymore. It's got a paywall. Chicago Tribune's had a paywall. It's terrible. There's just not a lot of places to get good information about what's going on in Chicago, and I find that you really do cover what's going on with the city and the mayor in a very thorough way, and so I appreciate what you do.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that very much. And I will say, Illinois Policy Institute, the last 6 years, we've really built out an audience that's a lot bigger than any of the traditional media players in the state for that reason. It's either sometimes not covering issues that are important to people, and oftentimes, and this is our big blessing as folks in this space, we can actually direct people to an action to fix some of the problems, which you're not going to get from, traditional news.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, well, let's talk about Chicago. I mean, there's so much to get to. I mean, we can talk about the mayor. I guess let's talk about the mayor on a scale of 1 to 10. Let's talk about the city itself. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the city's doing great, we're in great shape fiscally, culturally, on all of these different issues, and 1 being is like it's a disaster. We are in a death spiral. Where would you rate the city right now as far as how all of these things stand?
I would say Chicago is the greatest American city and it's the worst governed. So it depends what axis you're measuring. As a city, our fundamentals are so incredible, as you know. I mean, our natural resources are ridiculously good. Our talent pool is ridiculously good. The diversity of our economy is really good. We're not like a Detroit, one industry town that's really vulnerable to shocks in a specific sector. All of our biggest problems, whether it is corruption or crime or taxes or competitiveness generally, are man-made problems. And that actually gives me hope because the solutions are man-made too, and they're not really, crazy solutions. They're within reach.
But you talk about governance, and the city's been governed by Democrats forever. But we seem to have, you go back to Mayor Daley and then, Rahm Emanuel and then Lori Lightfoot, and we've been moving sort of consistently further left, and the city keeps electing mayors to the left. And so in some sense, we kind of get what we've asked for as a city. But talk about this mayor in particular and how he's handled the job thus far. I mean, again, we can talk about a bunch of different aspects, but just, broadly speaking,
Sure.
how would you rate his performance as leader of the city?
Sure. Well, first, just on this idea of, the people of Chicago have spoken, I think that's actually false, especially when you're talking about who the mayor is. And that's because of, something we may talk about later, but one of the freakish parts of Chicago and our governance structure is that we're the only big city in the country to hold our elections when everybody does not vote. We're the only big city to hold our elections in February of off years, which, as you know, that's the worst time to be in the city of Chicago. It's February. So unsurprisingly, turnout is less than half of that of presidential elections. In this last mayoral election, you saw, in the first round, around 30%, maybe even less, and then in the mid 30% turnout. So that really advantages special interest groups in those elections. And I will say the biggest special interest group that's left in the city of Chicago is the Chicago Teachers Union. And that's how we have our current mayor. Anyone who's interested in them as an entity, I think the story of them is relevant nationally and how they've built power here and how the Teachers Union has been radicalized and is building power nationally. We did a documentary on them. You can watch it at chicagoteachersunion.com because despite being a $30 million a year organization, they did not own their own name as a URL. So you can watch our documentary about them there. It's called Local One. And really, the Chicago Teachers Union it's the new machine. It is self-described radical, self-described socialist, Marxist organizers took over this union in 2010 and really turned it into a political machine. And that political machine is what elected ultimately Brandon Johnson. So when you look at his governance, the most important thing to understand is that the most important wielder of political capital in the city is the special interest group that is highly ideological called the Chicago Teachers Union. They are telling him what to do. He's their former employer, and he was an organizer at CTU, and they were his #1 funder. So you see all sorts of really actions out of step with the average Chicagoan, whether it's canceling our gunshot detection system, ShotSpotter, whether it's getting involved in global issues like the war in Gaza, whether it's trying to put a socialist in charge of the zoning committee, which decides basically every element of development in the city. The mayor is kind of pushing this agenda. But what's encouraging is the people of Chicago are pushing back. And we saw this with his marquee tax proposal. It was called Bring Chicago Home this last spring. And that was a tax that would have tripled the transfer tax on all real estate over $1 million in the city of Chicago, whether it's a corner store or a mansion. And the money was supposed to go to homelessness services. And everybody thought this was going to pass by 1 billion, right? Just like you said, like we're moving further and further left. The city is in favor of these progressive policies, and it lost because people did not trust the CTU and people did not trust Brandon Johnson with that new tax money.
Well, on that score, I mean, you mentioned our election date, and it is horrible. Is there? We also are a city. There was no mechanism to recall the mayor, but now there is. Now there's going to be potentially an option for that. Is there any? Do you think there will be any move to, because of that, to move the election date or to try and get more people involved in the process to break this stranglehold that, as you mentioned, special interests, in particular the teachers union, sort of have on the process?
Yeah, and this is a good time to mention this. It's something that I've been working on for several years and will be dedicated really in earnest to this over the next 2, because I think there's a huge opportunity to get it done. Chicago's the only big city in the country that does not have a city constitution. It does not have what's called a city charter. Every other big city in the country has this. And just like the US Constitution or the state constitution, it provides what? Checks and balances, a rational distribution of power, a process that everybody has to follow when you're trying to change the rules, right? And we've operated in absence of that since the dawn of the city. And so it's no surprise that we just keep, driving off the road and into a ditch. So a charter can govern things like, what is the election timing? Why, instead of having it at this ridiculous time. It has things like, for example, in Los Angeles, their charter has a provision for recall of the mayor. Chicago is one of 4 of the top 15 cities that has no mechanism for a recall. Thankfully, there has been a bill introduced in Springfield by a Chicago Democrat, LaShawn Ford, that would establish that mechanism, and that's not been voted on in Springfield yet. But our lack of a city charter puts us in this position of this mother may I relationship with the state, where we say, Chicagoans are like, I don't want the election at this time. And they're like, well, you got to go to the state. I want to be able to recall the mayor. Oh, you got to pass a state law. A city charter completely changes that.
And it's interesting. We've also seen, you mentioned the mayor's tax proposal, right? He started his budget, I think it was like 365 million in taxes, and then it went to like 100 million, then it went to 67 million, then it went to 0. And we saw the backlash with what he did with the city council and firing the head of schools. And there's been real pushback, even among members of his own party, the way he's governed. His approval rating is, I think the last time I saw it was like 19%. It literally, it's hard to imagine it getting any lower. And so I guess the question is, what sort of opportunities does that provide for reform? And do you think this mayor is going to, will he even be able to run for re-election? And do you think he's going to be a one-termer?
I think he will absolutely be a one-termer. The opportunity here lies in 2 ways. One, I think, is our political culture has really awakened to the fact that the Chicago Teachers Union, which used to poll, 60, 70% favorable in the city of Chicago, which is unsurprising because it's 3 words that everybody in the city likes: Chicago and teachers and union. But in fact, only 17 cents of every dollar they spend is on teacher representation. The rest is on administration, politics. And there has been a true awakening among the people of Chicago that very, very powerful institution, the #1 spender on politics in our city, does not have the interests of the city in mind. And you've seen their favorables go down. The last time I checked on them, they're in the 28 or 30% of Chicagoans have a favorable opinion of them. That's critically important because they engage not just in city politics or state politics, they engage in national politics. And the fact that their brand has rightfully so become toxic because of some of the things that they've done, that's great for the political culture of the city. So that's one. 2, I think this mayor is serving as the greatest example of why lacking a real structure of city governance is a huge risk to the city and a huge problem. I think it, similar to how John Mulaney famously described Trump as like a horse in the hospital in his first term, which is kind of, it's running around and it's very chaotic. Similarly to Mayor Brandon Johnson in Chicago, he's knocking over all of these things. He's going for these high interest short-term loans, doing very risky behavior that will affect the city for decades. And he's allowed to do that because we don't have any checks on mayoral power really in the city of Chicago. So you're seeing Democrats, especially in the city and the state legislature, say, wow, we should really look at this thing called the city charter and why it's necessary. So that makes me hopeful.
All right. Well, we'll end on that hopeful note. Austin Berg, Vice President of Marketing for the Illinois Policy Institute. Once again, if you don't follow Austin, please do. It's at Austin_Berg. That's AUSTIN_BERG. Austin, keep up the good work, and we'd love to have you back sometime.
Of course. Thank you, Tom.
All right. That's going to do it for us. On behalf of Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM, I'm Tom Bevan. We will see you back here. Good night.